Hello. The book that I'm going to read now is The Communist Manifesto, and it is written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So, before deep diving to the book, I'll just do the basic search. And if you type who is the father of communism, then it'll come Karl Marx, and he's a German philosopher, social and political theorist, economist, journalist, and revolutionary socialist. He developed the theory of historical materialism, analyzing class struggle under capitalism and predicting the systems overthrown by the proletariat in favor of the communism. Okay, so who started was the communism? It was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848 with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. However, its practical implementation as a form of a government was later pioneered by the Vladimir Lenin. So you have like a communist, which is Leninism. I think there is a term, right? Leninism versus communism. Okay, so Leninism is a political ideology developed by the Russian Marxist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. It adapted Orthodox Marxism to 20th century realities, advocating for a revolutionary vanguard party to lead the working class violent. Okay, so what is the core pillar and what is the differences between Leninism versus Marxism or communism? Communism is a broad socio-economic and political goal, stateless, classless society with a common ownership of productions. Leninism is a specific practical political strategy developed by Vladimir Lenin. It serves as the revolutionary blueprint for a stepping stone designed to actively achieve that communist. Okay, so it's same. Communism, the ultimate end goal of a society. A revolutionary method to achieve that goal. Leninism, and stateless, the concept of government withers away and classes disappear. Heavy state control utilizes a strict dictatorship with the proletariat and managed with directly. Okay, Karl Marx and okay, Vladimir Lenin. Now, what is the differences between communism versus uh, communism? Marxism. Okay, Marxism. Right, so Marxist. Marxism is the theoretical and philosophical framework established by the Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that critique capitalism. Communism is the ultimate political and economic goal of that theory, a stateless. Okay, so Marxism is the theoretical and philosophical framework established by the Karl Marx. Okay, Marxism means it is a theoretical and philosophical framework established by the Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that critique capitalism. Communism is the ultimate political and economic goal of that theory, a stateless, classless, and moneyless society where the community collectively owns the means of production. So essentially, Marxism is the analysis of the problem. Marxism is the analysis of the problem. Communism is the proposed solution. And okay, so so yeah. And okay, so now we'll talk about the brief history of the Karl Marx, right? Okay, brief history of Karl Marx because he is the person who wrote the entire thing. And Karl Marx was a German philosopher, economist. Okay, collectively known as a Marxism, argues that capitalism is inevitably drives a class conflict. He co-authored the Communist Manifesto and wrote his magnum opus, Das Kapital, shaping global political history. Early life in education. So born on May 5th, 1880 in Trier, Prussia and modern-day Germany, to a middle-class Jewish family that converted to Protestantism. So he was a Jewish but converted to Christianity. And education, studied law, history, and philosophy at the University of Bonn and the University of Berlin, ultimately earning his doctorate from the University of Jena in 1841. Early influence, he was heavily influenced by the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel and radical ideas of the left Hegelians in Berlin. Activism, journalism, expression, work as a journalist and editor in Cologne, but his radical writing led to the exile from Persia, Paris, and Brazil due to the censorship and governmental pressure. Okay, so he was exiled from Persia, Paris, Brazil due to the censorship. Okay, lifelong partnership in 1844. He formed a lifelong intellectual partnership with the friendship with the Friedrich Engels, okay, Ian Engels, Communist Manifesto at the request of the Communist League. Marx and Engels wrote the seminal pamphlets advocating for the overthrow of the capitalism system by working class proletariat. Later life in London, exile, fleeing Europe amid the 1848 revolution. Marx settled in London in 1849, where he lived the remainder of his life in relatively poverty. Das Kapital. In London, he wrote the first volume of his seminal work, Das Kapital, offering a rigorous critique of political economy and capitalism. International 1864 helped the found International Working Men. Okay, death is because he was died. He died on 14 March 1883. This is continuing. Okay, so I want to see Das Kapital. I've heard about this also. Das Kapital. Capital book, and I want to know how. Okay, so it does seem to me that it's the volume one is 546. Production of the relative surplus. Okay, and okay, so all of these things. Okay, that's capital. And so yeah, now let's before reading, I think I need some basic understanding of some words, right? So here, bourgeois, bourgeois way, right? So, bourgeois, right? So bourgeois ways. I mean, I is it bourgeois ways or bourgeois? Right? Bourgeois means it's a French term, and it means the I wouldn't say it's an aristocrat, but bourgeois means those people who own the production of means of production, right? Who are the the people who own those things, and there's a bourgeois, and then there is a bourgeoisie, okay, bourgeoisie, something like that, and then there is a proletariat. So proletariat people are the working class people, and they yeah. So I'll just wait. Okay, I'll just search bourgeois, right? I'm a little concerned about the pronunciation. Bourgeoisie, 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 bourgeoisie. That's okay. Bourgeoisie, yeah, bourgeoisie, 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 bourgeoisie. Okay, so bourgeoisie, and bourgeoisie, it refers to the wealthy and middle class. So, I mean, yeah, normally if you're talking about the bourgeoisie, it's a middle class people, but it refers to the wealthy and middle class members of the society who owns the means of production, such as the businesses, factories, land, and derive their wealth from a capital rather than a physical labor. History. The word comes from the Old French word bourgeois, which originally referred to the inhabitant of the walled towns or borough. During the late Middle Ages, unlike the rural peasants or aristocratic nobility, the early town people gained wealth and power through trade and governments. The Marxist theory. In 19th century, the German economist and philosopher Karl Marx popularized the term to describe the ruling capitalist rules, capitalist class. In Marxist theory, society is split into two primary groups: the bourgeois, the bourgeoisie, the wealthy elite who own the means of productions, and the proletariat, the working class who owns nothing but their labor and must work for bourgeois to survive. Marx argued that the bourgeois maintain their power and wealth by exploiting the labor of the proletariat, paying them less than the cultural values of this one. Talking modern and cultural usage in popular speech, the adjective bourgeois is often used as a derogatory term, frequently shortened to bourgeois. It describes the attitudes. Understood. Now let's go to the book, and it's a very, 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 very short book. It's, I think, around like 60 pages and should be able to finish in 1 hour. Okay. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Okay. Manifesto to the Communist Party. A specter is haunting Europe. A specter is haunting Europe, and the specter of communism. Specter, I mean, as far as I know, specter means like a ghost, right? A specter is haunting Europe, and the specter of communism. All the powers of the old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this is an specter. Pope and czars, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been described as a communistic by its opponents and power, with the opposition that has not hurled back the branding approach of the communism against the more advanced opposition parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. Communism is already acknowledged by all European power to be itself a power. It is high time that two things result from this fact. First is to communism is really already acknowledged by all the European powers to be itself a power. It is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, view their aims, their tendency, meet their nursery tales of the specters of the communism and the manifestos of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto, published in English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish language. Bourgeois and bourgeois and the proletarians. Okay, proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of the class struggle. Free man and slave, patricians and plebeians, lord and serfs, guildmasters and journeymen and were oppressors and oppressed, and stood in a constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fights, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitutions of a society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earliest epoch of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society in various orders to have manifold gradations of a social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, okay, just wait, plebeian. Okay, I've heard of this in PLES. Lesbian. Lesbian, right? Okay.
Plebeian.
Okay, it's not lesbian. I'm sorry. It's plebeian. There's no S. Okay. Plebeians. From or connect with ordinary people or people from low social class, lacking cultural education course. Plebeian, right? Okay, plebeian.
Plebeian.
Plebeian. Plebeian refers to members of the common or working class, originally denoting the average citizens of an ancient Rome, as opposed to the privileged patrician classes. The term is broadly used today as a noun adjective to describe ordinary people, occasionally as somewhat derogatory term for something considered unrefined or low born. Okay, plebeian, right? Okay, plebeian. In the early epochs of the history, we almost find everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various ones. The manifold gradations of society. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, we had feudal lords, to vassals, to guildmasters, to journeymen, apprentice, serfs in almost all of these classes again, and subordinates, gradations. The modern bourgeois society has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society, has not done away with the clash antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new condition of oppressions, new form of struggles in place of the old ones. Our approach, the approach of the bourgeois, possesses, however, these distinct features that it has simplified, the class antagonism. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeois and proletariats. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burgesses of the earliest times. From this bourgeoisie, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the founding of the Cape, open up fresh ground for its rising, bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese market, the colonizations of the America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of the exchange in commodities generally gave to the commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to revolutionary elements in the tottering feudal system, like a feudal society, rapid developments. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by the closed guilds, now no longer sufficed with the growing monster for the new market. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. A division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of a division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the market has kept, ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer suffice. There are steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture were taken by a giant modern industry. The place of the industrial middle age by industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industries have established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development in commerce, to navigation, to communication, finance. This development has, in its time, reacted on the extension of history, and in a proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, all way, railway extended. In the same proportion of the bourgeois developed and increased its capital and pushed into the background, every class handed from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeois is itself the product of the long course of developments of a series of revolution in the modes of the production and exchange. Its step in the developments of the bourgeois was accompanied by the corresponding political advancement of the society. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval communes, their independent urban republic as in Italy and Germany, their taxable third states of the monarchy as in the France afterwards. In the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counter was against the nobility, and in fact cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. The bourgeoisie, at least since the establishment of the modern industry and work of the world market, conquered for itself. In the modern representative states, exclusive political sway, the executive of the modern state is but a committee of managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hands, has put an end to the all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relation. It has pitilessly torn asunder the mortally feudal ties that bound man to its natural superior, and has left remaining no other nexus between a man and a man that naked self-interest and calloused cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of a religious fervor, of a chivalrous enthusiasm, of a Philistine sentimental, sentimentalisms, in the icy water of egoistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in the place of numberless and feasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free to its, in one word, for exploitations veiled by religious and political illusions, named naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitations. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with a reverent awe. It has converted the physicians, the lawyers, the priest, the poet, and the man of the sacrifice into its paid wage laborer. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veils, and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relations. The bourgeoisie had disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful hedonist. It has been the first to show that what a man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders for surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, the gold, okay, the Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in shades of the all for all former exodus of the nations and crusaders. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relation of productions, and within them the whole relation of society. Conservations of the old models of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence of all earlier industrial cases. Constant revolutionizing of the production, uninterrupted disturbance of all society's social conditions, and everlasting uncertainty and agitation that distinguish the bourgeois epoch from the earlier one, all fixed, fast frozen relations with a train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinion are swept away. All new formed ones become antique before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profane, and a man is at last compelled to face with a sober sense his real conditions of life and his relation of this kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its product chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitations of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great charging of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national grounds on which it stood. All the old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all the civilized nation. By industries that no longer work up the indigenous raw material, but the raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose product are consumed not only at homes but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the gold wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for the satisfactions the products of the distant lands and claims. In place of the old local nationalism, solutions, and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependency of our nations. As in the material, so also in intellectual production, the intellectuals creations of the individuals to nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness becomes more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises the world literatures, the bourgeoisie. But the rapid improvement of all instruments of the productions by the immensely facilitated means of communication draws even the most barbarian nation into a civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all the Chinese world, with which it forces the barbarian intensity obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into the means that is to become bourgeois to themselves, to invert where it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to make the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from idiocracy of a rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on the nations of the bourgeois, the east on the west. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with a scattered state of population of the means of productions and property. It has agglomerated production and has concentrated property in a few hands. To the necessary consequence of this was a political centralizations, independent or but loosely connected provinces with a separate interest, laws and governments and system of taxations became lumped together into one nation. So with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one custom static. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all have preceding generation together. Subjections of the nature's forces to man machinery, application of chemistry to industries and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of a whole continents of this cultivation, canalizations of rivers, whose population of conjured of the grounds were earlier, had even a pre-sentiments that such productive forces slumbered in the soul, lap of the social labor. We see then the means of productions of exchange on which was foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, which originated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of productions and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged the feudal organizations of agriculture and manufacturing industries. In one word, the feudal relation of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters, they had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder into the place stepped free competition accompanied by social and political constitution adapted to it and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. A modern bourgeois society with its relation of production and of exchange of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of productions and of exchange is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he had called upon by his spell. For many a decades past, the history of industries and commerce is but the history of the revolt of the modern producers forces against modern conditions of the productions against the property relation that are the conditions for the existence of bourgeois and its role. It is enough to mention that commercial crisis that by the periodical returns puts on its trial each time more threateningly the existence of the entire bourgeois society. In this crisis, a great part not only of the existing products but also of the previously created production forces are periodically destroyed. In this crisis, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier approach would have seemed an absurdity. The epidemic of overproduction society suddenly finds itself but back in a state of a momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence, industries, and commons seems to destroy it. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industries, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tends to further the developments of the conditions of the bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have been so powerful for these conditions by which they have fettered. And so soon as they can overcome these fighters, they bring disorders into the whole of the bourgeois society, endanger the existence of the bourgeois property. The condition of the bourgeois society are too narrow to compromise the wealth they created by them. And how does the bourgeois get over these critics? On the one hand, enforced instructions of a master of production forces. On the other hand, by the conquest of a new market, and by the more thorough exploitations of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby a crisis are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeois felt feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeois itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapon that brings death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, that is the capital, is developed in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. Okay, just wait. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, that is capital, is developed in the same proportion in the proletariat, the modern working class to develop a class of the laborer who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only as long they resist capital. These laborers must sell themselves piecemeal or commodity, like every other articles of the commons. They are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of the competition, to all the fluctuation of the market, owing to the extensive use of the machinery and to the division of labor. The work of the proletarians has lost also individual characters, and consequently all the charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knife that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of the subsistence that he requires from his maintenance and the propagations of his race. But the price of the commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases, nay more. In proportion as the use of the machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of the toil also increases, whether by prolongations of the working hours, by increase of the work enacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. Modern industries has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of the laborers crowd into the factory are organized like the soldiers as privates of the industrial army. They are placed under the commands of the perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are these slaves of the bourgeois classes and of the bourgeois states, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machines, by the overlookers, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaiming again to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embedding it is, to the less skill and extortions of this trend implied in a man. In other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of the men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinct social validity for the working classes. All are instruments of the labor, more or less expensive to use, according to the age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of a laborer by the manufacturer so far at the ends that he receives his wage in a cash, he is set upon the other proportion of the bourgeoisie. The landlord, the shopkeeper, and the pawn the brokers, etc. The lowest strata of a middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, retired tradesmen, generally the handicraftsmen and the peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalist, partly because the specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production. Thus the proletariat is recruited from all the classes. Thus the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. Proletariat goes through various stages of development with its
birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual labor, by then by the work people of the factory, but then by the operatives of one trades in one locality against the individual bourgeoisie, who directly exploits them. They direct their attack not against the bourgeois conditions of the production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that competes with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the middle class ages. At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent masses scattered over the whole country and are broken by the mutual competitions. If any, where they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeois, to which classes, in order to retain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, is moreover yet for a time able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletariats do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies. The remnants of the absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeois. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeois. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeois. But with the developments of the industry, the proletariat not only increases its number, it becomes concentrated in a greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels its strength more. The various interests and conditions of the life within the rank of the proletariats are more and more equalized in proportion as the machinery of creates all distinction of labors, and nearly everywhere reduces wage of the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crisis makes the wages of the workers even more fluctuating. Thus, the unceasing improvement of the machinery ever more rapidly developing makes their livelihoods more and more precarious. The collision between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more characters of the collision between the two classes. Thereupon, the workers began to form combination trades union against the bourgeois. They clubbed together in order to keep up the rates of the wages. They found permanent association in order to make the provisions beforehand for the occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out in riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of the battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding unit of the workers. The union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by the modern industry, and that places workers at the different localities in contact with one another. It was just that this contact was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same characters, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union to attain what the broadcast of the Middle Ages with their miserable highways required centuries. The modern proletarians, thanks to railway, achieved in a few years. These organizations of the proletarians into a classes and consequently into political parties continued being upset again by the competition between the Soviet workers themselves. But it never rises up again stronger, firmly, mightiest. It compels legislative recognition of the particular interest of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10-hour bill in England was carried. Altogether, the collision between the classes of the old society further in many ways the course of the developments of the proletariats. The bourgeoisie find itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portion of the bourgeois itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of the industries at all times. The bourgeois of the foreign countries in all this battle, it seems itself compelled to appeal to the proletariats to ask for its help and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariats with its own instruments of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with the weapon for fighting the bourgeoisie. Further, as we have already seen, entire section of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, precipitated in the proletariats, or are at least threatened in their condition of existence. This also supply the proletariats with the fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hours, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling classes, in fact, within the whole range of society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary classes, the class that holds the true future in its hand. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie. Now the portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is really revolutionary classes. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of the modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasants, all this fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as a fraction of the middle classes. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative, nay anymore. Nay more. So they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of the history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending and transfer into the proletariats. They thus defend not their present but their future interest. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariats. The dangerous class, the social scum, the passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society, nay, here and there be swept into the movement by proletariat's revolution, its condition of the life. However, prepare it far more for the part of the ripe tool of the reactionary entry. In the conditions of the proletariat, those of the old society at large are the already virtually swamped. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children no longer anything in common with the bourgeois's family relation. Modern industrial labors to modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national characters. Low moralities, religion started to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurks in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the preceding classes that caught the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to the conditions of appropriations. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous made mode of production, appropriation, then thereby also every other previous modes of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all the previous securities for an insurance of individual property. All previous historical movement were movement of minorities stored in the interest of the minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratums of our society, present society, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent and strata of its official society sprung into the air. Though not in the substance yet in a form, the struggle of the proletariats with the bourgeois is at first a national struggle. The proletariats of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeois. In depicting the most general phases of the developments of the proletariats, we trace the more or less veiled civil war raging within the existing society up to the point where the war breaks out in the open revolution and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeois lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariats. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonisms of the oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can at least continue to slavish existence. The serf, in the period of the serfdoms, to raise himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois under the yoke of the feudal absolutism managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the condition of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeois is unfit any longer to the ruling class in society and to impose its condition of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink in such a state that it has to feed him. Instead of being fed by him, society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with the society. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of a capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between laborers and the advance of industries, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie. Replaces the isolation of the laborers due to the competition by the revolutionary combination due to association. The developments of the modern industry therefore cut from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates product. What the bourgeois therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. It falls and the victory of the proletariats are equally inevitable. Okay, I want to read it itself. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation or augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is a wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on the competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to the competition by the revolutionary competition due to association. The developments of the modern industry therefore cuts from one's feet, the very foundation which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates product. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own graveyard. It falls, and the victory of the proletariats are equally inevitable. Second chapter: proletarians and communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? So the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interest separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties is only in the national struggle of the proletarians of the different countries. They point out and bring to the front the common interest of the anti-proletariats and independently of nationalities. Second,
In the various stages of developments which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere presents the interest of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute sections of the working class parties of every country, the sections which pushes forwards all other classes. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great masses of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the condition, the ultimate general results of the proletariat movements. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of the all other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class overthrow by the bourgeois in a bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power of the proletariats. The theoretical conclusion of the communists are in no way based on the ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would be universal reformers. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of the existing property relation is not at all distinct features of communism. All property relation to the past have continually been subject to historical changes, consequent upon the changes in historical conditions. To the French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of the bourgeois property. I think French Revolution happened in around 17, right? Just wait. French Revolution happened, I think Louis 16. Yeah, so 1789, 1776. America got independent. Okay, 1776, America got independent, and 1789. Okay, French Revolution happened. Okay, this distinguishing features of a communism is not the abolitions of property generally, but the abolition of a bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating product that is based on the class antagonisms on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of communist may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of a private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of the personally acquiring property as the fruit of the man's own labors, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of the all personal freedoms, to activity and independence, hard wants to self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisans and the small peasants and a form of a property that preceded the bourgeois forms? There is no need to abolish that. The development of the industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and it's still destroying it daily. Or do you mean modern bourgeois property, private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates a capital that is the kind of a property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon the condition of a begetting of new supply of a wage labor for the fresh exploitations. Property in its present form is based on the antagonisms of a capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of the antagonisms. To be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united actions of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united actions of all the members of society can it be set in motions. Capital is therefore not personal; it is a social power. When therefore capital is converted into a common property, when therefore capital is converted into a common property, into the property of all members of the society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of a wage labor is the minimum wage. That is that quantum of the means of the subsistence which is absolutely request in bare existence as a laborer. What therefore the wage laborer appropriates by the means of this labor merely suffice to prolong and reproduce by bare existence. Why by no means intend to abolish the personal? We by no means intend to abolish the personal appropriation of the product of a labor, and an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of a human life, and that leaves no surplus wherein to command the labor of the others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriations, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In a communist society, accumulated labor is not a means to widen, to enrich the systems. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In a communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of the state of a thing is called the bourgeois
is called by the bourgeois abolition of the individualities and freedoms, and rightly so. The abolition of the bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly indexed. By freedom is meant under the present bourgeois conditions of the production is free trade, free selling, buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying also disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all the other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with the restricted selling and buying with the fettered trades of the middle class ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of the buying and selling of the bourgeois conditions of the productions and of the bourgeoisie itself. You're horrified at our intending to do away with the private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done with for the ninth, tenth of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore we intending to do away with the form of property, the necessary condition for the existence, whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely that is just we want intent. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into a capital, money or a rent into a social power capable of being monopolized, that is, from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into a bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment you say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept away of the way and made possible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor and by other means of production, such appropriations. It has been objected that upon the abolition of the private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs, through sheer idleness for those of its member who work, acquire nothing and nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but rather expression of the tautology, that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. All objection urged against the communistic modes of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been argued against the communistic modes of producing and appropriating intellectual products, as for the just as to the bourgeois. The disappearance of the class property is the disappearance of the production itself. So the disappearance of a class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all cultures. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of the freedoms, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the growth of the conditions of your bourgeois productions and bourgeois property, just as yours jurisprudence is but the will of your classmate and a law for all. A will is exist in essential character and directions are determined by the economic condition of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature's reasons, the social forms springing from your present modes of productions and from our proper historical relations that rise and disappears in the progress of the production. These misconceptions you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of the ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois from property. Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare at this infamous proposal of the communist. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based on capital, on private gains, and it's completely developed from this family exist only in among the bourgeoisie. But the state of things find its complements in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitutions. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when when its complement vanishes, and both will vanishes when the vanishing of the capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of the children by their parents to the crime this week pleading guilty? But you will say we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by socials, and your education is not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools, etc. The communists have not invented the intervention of a society in education. They do but seek to alter the characters of their intervention and to rescue education from the right of the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlations of the parents and child, becomes all the more disgusting the more by the action of modern industry. The whole family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and the children transformed into a simple articles of the commerce and instrument of labor. But you communists would introduce a community of women and screams the whole bourgeois and show chorus. Bourgeois sees in her wife a mere instrument of her production, He reiterates that the instruments of the production are to be exploited in a common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that lot of the being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point is to do away with the status of the women as a mere instruments of the productions. But for the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignations of the bourgeois at the community of a women, which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of a women, but it has existed almost from time immemorial. It has existed from time immemorial. Okay, it has existed almost from a time immemorial. Our bourgeois are not content with having the wives and daughters of the proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of a common prostitute take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wife. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives and a commons, and thus at the most what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce the in substitution for a hypocritically and a concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it abolition of the community of women springing from that system, that is of prostitution, both public and private. The communists are further reproached with the desiring to abolish countries and nationalities. The working men have no country. We cannot take from what they have not got. So since the proletariat must fire of all, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to the must rise to be a leading class of the nation, must consist constitutes itself the nation. It is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the developments of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of productions and in the condition of the life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United actions of the leading civilized countries as least. It is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitations of the one individual by another is put an end to the exploitations of one nations by another, also put to an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. The charge against communists made from religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's idea, view, and conception, in one word, man's consciousness changes with the changes in the conditions of this material existence in his social reform relations and its social life? What else does the history of ideas prove? That the intellectual production changes its character in proportion as the material production is changed. The ruling ideas of each age have ever been in the ideas of its ruling classes. When people speak of the ideas that revolutionizes society, they do but express the fact that within the old society, the elements of a new one have been created, and the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old condition of existence. When the ancient world was in its last three years, the ancient religions were overcome by the Christianities. When Christianity ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeois. The ideas of religious liberty and the freedom of conscience merely gave expression of the sway of the free accomplishment within the domain of the knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of the historical developments, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive these changes. There are, besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all the states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all the religions and all the moralities instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acted in the contradiction to all the past historical experiences. What does these accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past societies has consisted in the developments of the class antagonism that assumed different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all the past ages, is the exploitations of one part of society by the other. No wonder then that the social consciousness of the past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms of or general ideas which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of a class antagonism. The communist revolution is the most radical ruptures with traditional property relation. Okay, the communist revolution. The communist revolution is the most radical ruptures with the traditional property relation. No wonder that the developments involve the most radical rupture with the traditional ideas. But let us have done with the bourgeois objection to communism. We have seen above that the first step in revolution by the working classes to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling as to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie to centralize all the instrumental productions in the hands of the state. That is the that is of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of the productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of the property and on the conditions of the bourgeois productions by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social orders, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the motor productions. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. First, abolition of property in land and application of all the rents of they to public purposes. Second, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Abolition of all the rights of inheritance. Abolitions of all rights of the inheritance. Confiscations of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Centralizations of credit in the hands of the states by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the heads of the states. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the states. The bringing into cultivations of wastelands and the improvements of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. Equal liability to all of the labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, combinations of agriculture with the manufacturing industries, gradual abolitions of the distinction between town and country, by more equitable distribution of the population of the country, free educations for all the children in the public school, abolitions of children factory and labor in its present forms, combinations of education with the industrial production. When in the course of development, the class distinction have disappeared and all the production has been concentrated in the hands of the vast association of the whole nations, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, property, so-called, is merely the organized powers of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of the circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of revolution it makes itself the ruling class and such as sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, with these conditions, have swept away the condition for the existence of the class antagonisms and upper classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free developments of the each is the condition for the free developments of all. I mean, I'm not entirely taking of the fact that it's not possible and it's not good for the society, but I think even in a communism, there are some things where it's very much true, right, in practical, that we do have to think about the income inequality as such, and it shouldn't be a reality where the poor are barely able to afford barely affording educations for their children's food. I mean, there should be a conditions where the basic necessities should be completely accessible for everyone, and then comes the next level where, if still the those common people want to do and try something, businesses and all, I think it should be free market, right? They have to compete like everyone else. They have to compete with the big guys, and this is exactly what I think. And now the chapter number 3. Chapter number 3 goes to socialist and communist literature. Socialist and communist are, I wouldn't say same, but both are left. And I think communists are extreme left and socialisms are center left. Okay, socialist and communist literatures, reactionary socialisms, feudal socialisms, owing to their historical positions, it became the vocations of the aristocracies of the France and England to write pamphlets against the modern bourgeois society. In the French revolutions of July 1830s and in the English reform agitations, this aristocracies again succumbed to the hateful upstart. Hence, for the serious battle, political contest was altogether out of the question. A literary battle alone remained possible, but even in the domain of literatures, the old cries of the Restoration spirit has been impossible. In order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy were obliged to lose sight, apparently, of their own interest and to formulate their dictum against the bourgeoisie in the interest of the exploited working class alone. Thus, the aristocracy took their revenge by signing lampoons on their new masters and whispering in his ear sinister prophecies of a coming catastrophe. In this way arose feudal socialism, half lamentations, half lampoon, half echo of the past, half menace of the future, at times by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticism, striking the bourgeoisie to the very hard coast, but always ludicrous in its effect through total incapacity to comprehend the march of the modern society history. The aristocracy, in order to rally the people to them, waved the proletarians arms back in front of the banners, but the people, so often as it joined them, saw on the headquarters the old feudal coats of arms and deserted with a loud and irreverent laughter. One section of the French legitimist and the young England exhibited this spectacle in pointing out that their mode of exploitation was different to that of the bourgeoisie. The feudalists forgot that they exploited under the circumstances and conditions that were quite different, and that are now antiquated, in showing that under their rule the modern proletariat never existed. They forgot that the modern bourgeoisie is the necessary offspring of their own forms of society. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary characters of the criticism that this cheap acquisition against the bourgeoisie amount of to this that under the bourgeois regimes, the class is being developed and which is destined to cut up roots and branch the old branch the old order of a society. Why they parade the bourgeoisie is not so much that it creates a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat. In a political practice, therefore, they join in all coercive measures against the working class in ordinary life, despite their high, falutin praises. They stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of the industries and to part Hertford's love and honors for the traffic in a wool, beetroot sugars, and potato spirits. As the person has ever gone, hand in hand with the landlord, as so has clerical socialism with the feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christians, asceticism as social socialist state. Has not Christianity, declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the states? Has it not preached in the place of those, these charities and poverty, celibacy and mortifications of the flesh, and monastic life and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrated the hard burning of the aristocrats. Petty bourgeois socialism. Petty bourgeois socialism. The feudal aristocracy was not only classes that ruined by the bourgeoisie, not only the classes whose condition of existence pinned and cherished the atmosphere of the modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses and the small peasants proper proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In these countries which are but little developed industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois have been formed, fluctuating between proletariats and bourgeoisie and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of a bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled around in the proletariat by actions of the competitions, and as the modern industries develop, they even see the moment approaching when they completely disappear as an independent section of modern society to be replaced in manufacturers, agriculture, and commerce, by overlookers, bailiff and the shopmen. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute for far more than the half of the population, it was natural that writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use in their criticism of the bourgeois regime the standards of the peasants and the petty bourgeois, and from the standpoint of these intermediate classes should take up the cut gills for the working class. Thus arose as a petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school, not only in France but also in England. The school of socialism dissected with a great acuteness the contradiction in the conditions of the modern productionist. It laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists. It proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effect of the machinery and division of labor, the concentration of a capital and land in a few in the hands, overproductions and crises. It pointed out the inevitable ruins of the petty bourgeois and peasants, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities and the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of an extermination between nations, and the dissolution of the old moral bonds of the old family relations of the old nationalities. In its positive aims, however, this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old property relations and the old society or to cramping the modern means of production and of exchange within the framework of the old property relations that have been and were bound to be exploited by those means. In neither cases, it is both reactionary and utopian. Its last words are corporate guilds for manufacture, patriarchal relation in agriculture. Ultimately, when stubborn historical facts had dispersed all intoxicating effects of the self-deceptions, these forms of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues. German or the true socialism, the socialist and communist literatures of France are literatures that originate under the pressures of the bourgeoisie and power, and that was the expression of the struggle against the power. I was introduced into Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie is the current in that country. It had just begun its contest with the feudal absolutism. German philosophers would be philosophers, and Boach's spirits eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when this writing immigrated from Germany to France to Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. In contrast with the German social condition, this French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. Thus, the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demand of the first French Revolution were nothing more than the demand of the practical reasons in general, and the utterance of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie signified in their eyes the law of the pure will as it was bound to be of a true human will. Generally, the world of the German literate consisted solely in the bringing the new French ideas into harmony with the ancient philosophical conscience, and rather in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic point of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, namely by translations. It is well known how the monks wrote silly lives of the Catholic saints over the manuscript on which the classical works of the ancient heathendoms had been written. The German literate reversed this process with the profane French literatures. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic fictions or functions of this money, they wrote alienation of humanity, and beneath the French criticisms of the bourgeois state, they wrote dethronement of the category of the journal, and so forth. The introduction of this the philosophy phrases at the back of the French historical criticism, the dubs, a philosophy of actions, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical foundation of a socialism, and so on. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated, and since it ceases in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with another one, he felt conscious of having overcome French one-sided stand of representing not true requirement, but the requirements of the truth, not the interest of the proletariats, but the interest of the human natures of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, and who exists only in this misty realm of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its soul's book task so seriously and solemnly and extolled its poor stock in trade in such a mountebank fashions, meanwhile, it gradually lost its pedantic innocence. The fight of the German and especially the Prussian bourgeoisie against feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchy, in other words, the liberal movement became more earnest. By this, the long wished for opportunity was to offer to true socialism of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalisms, against representative governments, against bourgeois competitions, bourgeois freedoms of the press, and bourgeois legislations, bourgeois liberty and equality of preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. But by this bourgeois movement, German socialists forgot in the name of time that the French criticism so silly echo, it was presupposed the existence of the modern bourgeois society with its corresponding economic conditions of existence in the political constitution adapted thereto. The very things whose attainment was the object of the pending struggle in Germany to absolute governments with their following of persons, professor, country, squires, and officially to serve as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisies. It was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of flogging and bullets with which this same government just at the time overdosed the German working class rising. While this true socialism thus served the government as a weapon for fighting the German bourgeoisie, it at the same time directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of the German Philistines. In Germany, the petty bourgeois class, a relic of the 6th century, since they constantly cropping upon again under the various forms, the real social basis of the existing state of things. To preserve this class, to preserve the existing state of things in Germany, the industrial and political threatening its with a certain destruction on the one hand from the concentration of a capital, on the others from the rise of the revolutionary proletariats. The true socialism appeared to kill these two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The rope of the speculative cobwebs, embroidered with the flowers of this rhetoric, steep in the way of dew of sickly sentiments, the transcendental rope in which a German socialist wrapped their sorry eternal truths, all skin and bones, served to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods among such a public. And on its parts, German socialism recognized more and more its own calling as the bombastic representative of the petty bourgeois Philistines. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nations and the German petty Philistines to be a typical man. To every meanness of this model it gives a hidden higher socialistic interpretations, the exact contrary to its real characters. It went to the extreme in the length of directly opposing the brutally destructive tendency of the communism and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of contempt of the all struggles, with very few exceptions. So then all the so-called socialist and communist publication that now circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and enervating literature. Okay. Now we'll talk about a conservative or bourgeois socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing against social grievance in order to secure the continued existence of the bourgeois society. To this section belong economists and philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of the charities, members of the society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperaments, fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has moreover been worked out in a complete system. We may cite Proudhon's philosophy, De la Miseria, an example of this form. The socialistic bourgeois wants all the advantages of the modern social condition without the struggle and the dangers necessarily resulting reforms. They desire the existing state of the society minus its revolutionist and disintegrating element. They wish for a bourgeois without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally conceive the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete system, in requiring the proletariats to carry out such a system and thereby to march straight away into the social New Jerusalem. But it requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. A second and more practical but less systematic form of socialism sought to depreciate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reforms, but only a change in the material conditions of existing economic relations could be of any advantages to them. By change in the material conditions of existing, this form of socialism, however, by no means understand abolition of the bourgeois relation to production and abolition that can be effected only by revolution, but administrative reforms based on the continued existence of the relations to reforms, therefore, that in no respect affect the relation between capital and labor, but at the best lessens the cost, simplify the administrative works for bourgeois governments. Bourgeois socialism attains adequate expressions when and only when it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reforms for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only serious meant word of the bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois. The bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. Critical utopian socialism and communism. We do not here refer to the literatures which in every great modern revolution has always given a voice to the demands of the proletariat, such as the writings of the perfect others. The first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends, made in times of universal excitements when a feudal society was being overthrown. These attempts necessarily failed owing to the dense, undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as to the absence of the economic condition for its emancipation, condition that had yet to be produced and could be produced by the impending bourgeois. The revolutionary literatures that accompanied this first movement of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary character, the incalculated universal asceticism and social leveling in its crudest forms. The socialist and the communist systems, property, so-called those of the Saint Simon Fourier, Owen, and others, spring into existence in the early undeveloped period described above of a struggle between proletariats and bourgeois. The founders of this system see indeed the class antagonisms as well as the actions of a decomposing elements in the prevailing form of society, but the proletariat, as yet in its infancy, offers to them this spectacle of a class without any historical initiative or any independent political movement. Since the developments of the class antagonisms keeps even pace with the developments of the industry, the economic situation, as they find it, does not as yet offer to them the material conditions of the emancipations of the proletariats. They therefore search for after new social science, after new social laws that are to create these conditions. Historical action is to yield to their personal inventive actions, historically created conditions of emancipations to fantastic ones, and the gradual spontaneous class organizations of the proletariats to the organizations of society, especially contrived by these inventors. Future history resolves itself in the eyes to in the propagandas from the practical carrying of the social plans. In the formation of their plans, they are conscious of carrying chiefly for the interest of the working class as being the most suffering classes. Only from the point of view of being the most suffering class does the proletariat exist for them. So the undeveloped state middle class struggles as well as their own surrounding causes socialists of this kind to consider themselves far superior to all the class antagonism. They want to improve the conditions of every members of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they habitually appeal to society at large without distinction of a class, nay, by preference of the ruling classes. For how can people, when once they understand their system, fail to see in it the best possible plan of the best possible state of society? Hence, they reject all political and especially all revolutionary actions they wish to attain their ends by peaceful means and endeavors by small experiments, necessarily doomed to failures, and by the force of the example to pave the way for the new social gospel. Such fantastic pictures of society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state and has but a fantastic conceptions of its own position, corresponded with the first instinctive yearning of the class for the struggle. yearning of the caste for general reconstruction of a society. But this socialist and communist publication contain also a critical elements. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable material for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in terms such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country of the families, of the carrying of the two industries for the accounts of the private individuals, and of this wage system, the proclamations of a social harmony, the convergence of the functions of the state into a mere superintendents of the productions. All these proposals point solely to the disappearance of the class antagonisms, which were at the time only just cropping up, and which in this publication are recognized in the earliest indistinct and undefined forms only. This proposal, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. The character of the significance of the critical utopian socialism or communism bears an inverse relation to the historical developments. In proportion as the modern class struggles takes definitive shape, this fantastic standing apart from the contest have this fantastic attack on it to lose all the practical value and theoretical justification. Therefore, although the originators of the systems were in many respects revolutionary, their discipline have in every case formed mere reactionary sites. They hold fast with the original views of the masters in opposition to the progressive historical developments of the proletariats. They therefore endeavor and that consistently to attend the class struggles and to reconcile the class antagonisms. They still dream of experimental realization of the social utopias of the founding isolated Palinstiadist of establishing a home colonist of setting up a little Icaria duodecimo edition of the New Jerusalem, and to realize all these castles in the years, they are compelled to appeal to the feeling and the purposes of the bourgeois. By degree, they sink into the category of a reactionary conservative socialist depicted above, differing from this only by a more systematic pleasantries and by the fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effect of the social science. They therefore violently oppose all the political actions on the part of the working class, and such actions, according to them, can only result from the blind unbelief in the news gospel. The Ovenites in England and the Fortierists of France, respectively, opposed the Chartist and Reformist. Now, the fourth position of the communist in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 has made clear the relation of the communists into the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in the America. The communist fights for the attainments of the immediate aims for the enforcement of the momentary interest of the working class, but in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of the movement. In France, the communists ally themselves with the social democrats against the conservatives and radical bourgeoisists, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to the racist and illusion traditionally handled down from the great revolutions. In Switzerland, they support the radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, party of a democratic socialist, in French sense, party of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support the party that insists on agrarian revolution as the prime conditions of the national emancipations. That party which fomented the insurrections of the Krakow in 1846. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it attacks in revolutionary ways against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squire anarchy, and the petty bourgeoisie, but they never ceased for a single instant to still instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonisms between bourgeoisie and proletariats, in order that the German workers may straight away use so many weapons against the bourgeoisie. The social and political conditions that the bourgeois must necessarily introduce, along with its supremacy, and in order that after the fall of the reactionary class in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. The communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany because the country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under the more advanced conditions of the European civilizations and with much more developed proletariats. And the that of England was in the 17th and the France in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to the and immediately following proletariat revolutions. In short, the communist everywhere supports every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all this movement, they bring to the front as the leading questions in each the property questions, no matter what degree of developments at the time. Finally, the labor everywhere for the unions and agreement of the democratic parties of countries. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling class tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletariat have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. I think this is a famous quote, right? I think I've seen it. The proletariat have nothing to lose but the chains. And they have a world to win. So it says that proletariats have nothing but a chain to lose. and they have everything to win, and they have a world to win. Okay, they have everything or the world to win. Working men of all countries unite. I'll be very honest. Okay, I've read it, and I don't know. Is it because of my the current intellectual capacity that I don't think I got 100% of the what I've read, honestly. So let me just go and article on the Communist Manifesto. Let's just see other people's perspective. Authored by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848, the Communist Manifesto is the foundation. Okay, so is there the manifesto of the Communist Manifesto? Okay, no. The Communist Manifesto is summary and quotation and facts. Okay, so there's a summary something. Okay, the Communist Manifesto of the Communist. Okay, pamphlets written by the Karl Marx to serve as the platform for the Communist League. It became one of the principal programmatic statements of the European socialist and communities and parts in 19th and 20th century. The Communist Manifesto embodies the author's materialistic conception of history, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of the class struggle, and it surveys that history from the ages of the feudalism down to the 19th century capitalism, which was destined, they declared, to be overthrown and replaced by the workers' society. The communist, the vanguard of the working class, constituted the section of the society that would encompass the abolition of private property and raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class. Okay, the Communist Manifesto opens up the dramatic words of a specter. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism, and ends by stating the proletariat have nothing to lose but the chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. Okay, yeah. And yeah, just wait. Karl Marx. Okay, what was Karl Marx? Okay, earliest. I think it's very important to understand the history or the journey of his career, because his ideology is heavily his ideologies or the learnings or unlearnings or relearnings of whatever he has done, the Communist Manifesto, whatever he has written, everything is because of the journey he has experienced, right? So let's just look at his journey, right? Okay, he was born in Rhine province, Prussia. There's a Rhine River, famous Rhine River. Okay, London. Okay, he died and was a revolutionary socialist. Okay, and was the oldest surviving of a boy of 9 children. His father, Heinrich, a successful lawyer, was a man of the Enlightenment, devoted to Kant and Voltaire. Okay, so who took part in agitations for constitutions in Prussia. His mother, born Henrietta Pressburg, was from Holland, but both parents were Jewish and were descended from a long life of rabbis. But a year or so before Karl Marx was born, his father, probably because his professional career required it, was baptized in the evangelical established church. Karl was baptized when he was 6 years old, although was his youth, Karl was influenced less by religion, but then by critical, sometimes radical social policies and enlightenments. His Jewish background exposed him to prejudices and discrimination that may have led him to questions of the role of religion in society and contributed his desire. Marx was educated from 1830 to 45 at the high school in Trier. Suspected of harboring liberal teachers and pupils, the school was under police surveillance. Marx, writing during the period, exhibited a spirit of the Christian revolutions. Okay, in 1835 he matriculated at the University of Bonn. He courses attended were exclusive in humanities and subjects such as the Greek and Roman mythology, history of art. He participated in customary student activities, fought a duel, spent a day in jail for being drunk and disorderly. He presided over the Traben clubs, which was at odds with the more aristocratic students. Okay, so this is how. Okay, and I started opening this up in efforts to disturb the session of this one. Okay, explained Berlin as his introduction to Hegel's philosophy, regnant there, and his adherence to the young Hegelians. As first he felt a repugnance towards Hegel's doctrines, but when Marx fell sick, it was partially, as he wrote to his father, from intense vexations at home and having to make an idol of a view I detested. The Hegelian pressures in the revolutionary student culture was powerful. However, the Marx joined a society called the Doctor Club, whose member was intensely involved in the new literary and philosophical movement. The chief figure was Bruno Brost, a young lecturer in theology who was developing the ideas of that Christian gospel were a record not of a history but of a human fantasies arising from emotional needs. So this is all. Okay, philosophy makes no secret of it. Okay, Prometheus' admission in soothes all gods. I hate its own admissions, its own motto against all gods. Promises the noblest saints and martyrs in the calendar philosophy. Okay. Okay, so he's a Brazil period of okay, so this is the entire history of him. And you could see Karl Marx, long beard, Role in the first internationals of Karl Marx. Okay, so this is the brief history bit and intellectual. Okay, so article on the Communist Manifesto. I want other people's article, their opinion. Communist Manifesto. No, I don't want a summary. So there is the Communist Manifesto 170 years later. Okay. So the Communist Manifesto 170 years later by Samir Amin, Geography Global, Subject History, Imperialisms and Marxisms. Okay. There is no other text written in the mid-19th century that has helped up, as well as the Communist Manifesto of 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Even today, entire paragraph of the text correspond to the contemporary reality better than they did it to in this report. Starting from the premises that were hardly visible in the era, Marx and Engels drew the conclusion that the developments of the 170 years of history fully verified. Were Marx and Engels inspired prophets, magicians, able to gaze into the crystal balls, exceptional beings with respect to their intention? No, they simply understood better than anybody else in their time and ours the essence of that which defines the characterized capitalism. Marx devoted his entire life to deepening this analysis through the twofold examination of a new economy, beginning with the examples of England and that new politics, starting from the example of France. Marx's Capital presents a vigorous scientific analysis of the capitalist mode of productions and capitalist society and how they differ from earlier forms. Volume 1 delves into the heart of the problems. It directly clarifies the meaning of the generalizations of the commodity exchange between the private owner private property owners, a phenomena that is in its centrality is unique to the modern world of capitalism. The commodity exchange existed earlier, specifically the emergence and dominance of the value and abstract social labor from that foundation. Marx leads us to understand how the proletarian sale of his or her labor powers to the man with the money ensures the production of a surplus value the capitalist expropriates, and which in turn is the condition for the accumulation of the capital. The dominance of the value governs not only the reproductions of the economic system of capitalism, but also every aspect of the modern social and political life. The concept of commodity alienation points to the ideological mechanisms through which the overall unity of the social reproduction is expressed. These intellectuals and political instruments validated by the developments of the Marxism demonstrate their worth in correctly predicting the general historical evolution of the Marx capitalist theory reality. No attempt to think about this reality outside of Marxism or often against it has led to the comparable result. Marxism critics of the limitations of the bourgeois thought, and in particular of its economic science, which he rightly described as a vulgar, is a masterful since it is incapable of understanding what capitalism is in its essential reality. This alienated thought is also unable to imagine where capitalist societies are going. Will the future be forged by the social revolution that will put an end to the domination of the capital, or will capitalism succeed in prolonging its days, thus opening the way to the decadence of the society? Bourgeois thought ignores this question posed by the manifesto. Indeed, we read in the manifesto that there is a fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitutions of the society at large or in the common reunion of the contending classes. The sentence has attracted my attention for a long time. Starting from it, I have progressively come to formulate a reading of the movement of reading. History focus on the concept of the unequal elements and the possible differences, possible different processes of its transformations, originating most probably from its peripheries rather than in its centers. I also made some attempts to clarify each of the two models of the response to the challenges, the revolutionary way and the way of decadence. Choosing to derive laws of the historical materialism from the universal experience, I have proposed an alternative formulation of one unique pre-capitalist mode, that is the tributary modes towards which all the classes societies tends the history of the West. The construction of the Roman antiquities, its disintegration, the establishment of the feudal Europe, and finally the crystallization of an absolute state of the mercantilist. It thus expresses the particular forms, the same basic tendency presented elsewhere towards the less discontinuous reconstruction of a complete tributary state, of which China is also the strong example. The slave mode is not universal in our reading of history, as are the tributary and the capitalist modes. It is particular and appears strictly in connection to the existence of the commodity relations. Furthermore, the feudal mode is the primitive and incomplete form of the tributary modes. These hypotheses views the establishment and subsequent disintegration of Rome as a premature attempt at tributary construction. The level of developments of the productive forces did not require arbitrary centralization scale of Roman Empire. This first unavailing attempt was thus followed by a forced transition through the feudal fragmentation, on the basis of which centralization was once again restored within the framework of the absolute monarchy of the West. Only then did the mode of the production in the West approach the complete tributary model. It was furthermore only the beginning with the stage the level of development of the productive forces in the West attained that of the complete tributary mode of the Imperial China. Okay. The backwardness of the West the backbone of the West expressed by the abortion of the Rome and by feudal fragmentation certainly gave its to its historical advantage into the combination of a specific elements of the ancient arbitrary modes and of a barbarian communal modes characterized by feudalisms, and it gave the West its flexibilities. This explained the speed with which Europe experienced complete arbitrarily phase, quickly surpassing the level of the developments of the productive forces of the East, which it overtook and passed on the capitalism. This flexibility and the speed contrasted with the relatively rigid and slow evolution of the complete tributary modes of the Orient. Doubtless, the Roman Western case is not the only example of a abortive tributary construction. We can identify at least three other cases of this type, which with its own specific condition, that Byzantine or Ottoman case, the Indian case, and the Mongol case, in each of the attempts to install tributary system or centralization were too far ahead of the requirements of the developments of the productive forces to be firmly established. In each cases, the forms of centralizations were probably specific combination of a state, para-feudal, commodity means in Islamic State, for instance, commodity centralization play the decisive role. Successive Indian failures must be related to the content of the Hindu ideology, which I gave contrast with the Confucianism. And as to this centralization of the empire, Genghis Khan, it was, as we know, extremely short-lived. The contemporary imperialist system also a system of centralization of a surplus at world scale. So centralization operating on the basis of the fundamental laws of the capitalist modes and the condition of its domination over the pre-capitalist modes of the subjective periphery. I have also formulated the laws of the accumulation of the capital of the law scale as an expression of the laws of value operating on the scales. The imperial system for the centralization of values characterized the acceleration of accumulations and revenues. Okay, so this is an article, right? Okay, the director of the, so it was written by Samir Ani, was the director of the Third World Forum in Dakar, Senegal, and the author of the many books, most recently Modern Imperialism, Monopoly, Finance, Capitalism, and Marx Laws of Values. The essay was the last sent to monthly review by the Samir before his death. He requested that we delay publication until it had first appeared in the, which has now occurred. Okay, so now